right, thank you very much, Josh, for that nice introduction. Welcome, Peter, and welcome everyone as you file into the stage here. As mentioned, Peter and I have known each other a long time, but I'll give a brief introduction of Peter Harrell. Peter Harrell is known as a very cerebral thinker with deep expertise and great experience in international relations, cross-border trade, cross-border capital flows, international sanctions, export controls, and the like. He's worked at the State Department and the White House. He's advised President Obama, has advised President Biden, has advised Secretary Clinton, Secretary Kerry, has been advising, Vice President Harris, and has been the White House member on the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. I could go on and take the full 20 minutes just with Peter's resume. But what I'd like to talk about tonight, or this afternoon, is U.S.-China relations and how, as investors, we should think about U.S.-China relations. And Peter, I want to take you through 3 assumptions that we make at Crane Shares when we think about China and investing in China. And I want to get your reaction to each, and then maybe we can talk about a few issues that might relate to those assumptions. The first assumption we make is that despite all the tension and pressure, the U.S. and China economies will remain integrated. There will be a level of interdependence. They're never going to be completely separate. China needs American consumers. America needs the Chinese supply chains and the like. These are the 2 largest economies in the world, and they need each other. I'd like your reaction to that first assumption.
No, well, first, thanks for having me here, and thanks for the introduction. And what I didn't get was the memo on the dress code out here, but it's great to be out here by the beach, and great to see all of you. I know you guys are running money. You guys are managing folks' money. So where does geopolitics come up? I'm going to hazard a guess. It comes up in 2 places. First, maybe you have a thesis around geopolitics. You're invested in China, or maybe you want to invest in somewhere that's going to capitalize as companies diversify away from China. Maybe you have an investment thesis. Or maybe just one of your clients asks you, I saw this in the news, what do you think, and how's that going to affect my portfolio? And that's important too. I spend a lot of my life these days working with corporate clients, and the CEO sees something in the Wall Street Journal and is like, what does that mean for me? So, we all kind of see how this plays out among our clients in our lives. On your thesis, I agree. The U.S. and the Chinese economies are too large and too deep to fully disconnect. And this idea that we're going to have kind of total decoupling, I just don't buy it. That said, I think we are seeing and are going to continue to see 2 big trends that are putting pressure on that relationship. First, in a couple of particular products and a couple of particular sectors. Thinking here, things like EVs. We are seeing that decoupling, right? That is here. We are not going to have Chinese EVs in this country because the political system is, for better or for worse, going to ensure that we are not going to see a lot of Chinese-made electric vehicles in this country over the next couple of years. And so we are going to see that in a couple of sectors. The other thing we're seeing is more steps. Right, it used to be an electronic device was assembled in China, components maybe went into China, assembled in China, and then came to the US. What we're seeing a lot in these trade flows now is some of the components are maybe made in China, then they go to Vietnam, the TV or the phone gets assembled in Vietnam or in India, and then comes to the US. You actually still have a lot of Chinese value and content there, but you're beginning to see a hop in that chain in response to some of these geopolitical tensions.
So a way to avoid some of the tariffs by sort of navigating the rules of origin, so to speak. The second assumption I want to ask you about, and then we're going to get to the reality versus rhetoric that is in the title of this discussion, is this idea that the U.S. and China are going to continue to be strategic competitors for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, so I do think, we are in an era of strategic competition. Now, I think you see a lot of rhetoric in Washington, worry about are we going to get into a shooting war? Is China going to invade Taiwan? That kind of thing. I think the odds of that are low. Probably not 0 over a 30-year period. 30 years is a very long time. But the odds of that are low. That said, I think on both sides, both Washington and Beijing, you are seeing our countries decide that they see each other as strategic competitors, which means we are going to be competing for economic primacy. We are going to be competing in a number of domains for technological primacy, and you're going to see us kind of outselling our influence in big key kind of swing states, whether that's Europe or Brazil or the Indonesias of the world.
So it's almost like an equipoise, right? Strategic competitors that can't be decoupled. That tension probably will cause economic growth in both countries, at least if it's managed well. And so the third proposition, the third assumption I want you to react to is this idea that, well, the Chinese economy is going to continue to grow. We don't know the rate of growth, but we know that there are three locomotives, if you will, that pull the global economy: Europe, the United States, and China. And we can count on continued Chinese growth as China becomes a more wealthy country.
Yeah, I actually want to go back to your second point on strategic competitors. So in 2021 and 2022, I spent 2 years working at the White House, kind of running the global economic file for the National Security Council, so trade and investment policy and CFIUS and these kind of things. And as a part of that, I went in, I saw the president fairly regularly, and I saw the National Security Advisor pretty much every day, and he had a whiteboard in his office, which had a set of kind of constantly changing priorities. COVID, that eventually faded away. Russia, popped up. Middle East, moved up. But there was also this whole column on one side that was just China, and kind of what we're doing on China might vary, but no matter what else was going on, China was up there. And I think that really brings home, as you say, David, that the political systems see these as strategic competitors. But on your question about growth, look, I can't speak to the economic mistakes Beijing's government is going to make that'll slow China's economic growth, right? There's a chance there. What I will say is, having spent a lot of time in China over the years, you have a very entrepreneurial country there. You have a very educated country there. The growth potential there is very, very high. I think that if China does continue to slow, it will be more driven by domestic mismanagement in China than the kinds of things we do. That said, I do think the way they are dealing with their slowdown, and we see this in the data, is to kind of double down on export-driven growth. They were investing heavily in infrastructure and housing and that kind of thing. The last couple of years, as they've tried to deleverage that sector, they have been putting more money in export-oriented growth, and we're seeing Chinese exports, not to the US, but globally, rise over the last few years, and they're higher percentage of manufacturing as a share of GDP than they had 5 years ago. I'm not sure that's sustainable, because I do think you're going to see the US and Europe as kind of the big consumer markets, right? The ones who are buying a bunch of this stuff are not going to become more dependent on China. I'm not sure we're going to reduce our current level, but we're not going to become more dependent. So I do think they're going to have to find another model if they want to maintain above 4 or 5% GDP growth rates.
And that's a perfect segue, I think, to this this point that China's been very deliberate. I've always found the most interesting part of following China as an investor, and we at CraneShares spend a lot of time looking at this, is China tells you what they're going to do. Every 5 years, they give you a 5-year plan. As investors, you can read it. There's a lot of detail. And the last 5-year plan said we're going to invest in electric vehicle development and other technologies. We're going to promote domestic consumerism, which I think goes to your point. We're going to try to wean ourselves off of a pure export of goods economy. And then we're going to develop a service economy, our own service economy. They've been very deliberate. They've told us they're going to do it. There's ups and downs and flat spots, but they're very deliberate, and as sort of the centralized government can do, unlike other types of systems of government, they can execute on it and mobilize the entire country on these points. Now, this, I've spent the day listening to other conversations about geopolitics on different stages here at the conference, and everyone seems to agree that smart investors have to have an awareness of geopolitics, that increasingly investment decisions must be made with geopolitics in mind. Sometimes there's tailwinds, sometimes there's headwinds. But we need to sort of dig down and answer the question, well, what does that really mean? What are the factors investors should be looking at when weighing geopolitics? And I want to ask you about 3 in particular that relate to China and relate to the U.S.-China economic competition. The first set is export controls. Yeah. That's very much front of mind. It's on the front page of the newspapers every day, and that is limitations imposed by the United States on goods, not so much services, but goods that can be exported to China. The second I'm going to ask you about is tariffs. This is the trade war. We heard a lot about it. Former President Trump, I think, is credited with really launching this sort of full-force trade war against China, but also imposing tariffs, frankly, on many other countries around the world. And then finally, talk about capital controls a little bit, or restrictions on capital and investment. And this is where the sort of rhetoric versus reality piece of this comes in. And let me explain, and I want your reaction. There's a lot of politics. We're in an election year. We're in kind of the home stretch of a national election in the United States. And everyone seems to agree that it's a great applause line to say, I'm going to be tough on China. Not a lot of detail, but you get a lot of applause by saying, you know, China's ripping us off. We need to be tougher on China. That's one thing all politicians in Washington seem to agree on. But what's the reality? When you have to protect the American economy and you have to continue to support global economic growth, what is the reality? And let's talk about that a little bit. Let's maybe start with export controls.
Yeah, so, you know, it's interesting because I think in a way, although both Trump and Biden, now Harris, reasonably hawkish on China, they're actually hawkish in somewhat different ways, right? Trump, as somebody who worked in the Trump administration put it to me, sort of didn't care about the moral or national security issues. He thought the Chinese were ripping us off, right? So he wanted to tariff what they were selling us, and he wanted to sell more American stuff to them. So he actually, we talk a lot about export controls today, but Trump actually facilitated the sale of things like semiconductors to China, and you could see a huge rise in U.S. computer chip sales to China export volumes under Trump. Biden came in and sees this more as a national security issue, so he starts imposing export controls. And so you can look at the chart of U.S. semiconductor sales to China goes up, peaks in 21, and then craters. Because from Biden's perspective, he views it as we are in a kind of political, technological competition, economic competition, and doesn't want them to have the most advanced chips. And so, you know, you take something like this. This has iPhone 15, what's called a 3-nanometer chip in it. That's how narrow it is. It's the most advanced current sort of chip that'll fit in a phone. Under Biden, you can't sell that chip to a Chinese company. You can sell it to China to be assembled into an iPhone for export, but you can't sell it to a Chinese company because he doesn't, it's not that he worries so much about the phones, but he worries that those chips or chips at that level could be integrated into servers and used to train AI and things like that in order to enable China to grow. Now, you cut off the sales of these chips to China, what do? They double down on domestic investments. They can't make 3-nanometer chips with their own technology yet, but they can make the chips with their own technology that Western firms were making 4 or 5 years ago, sort of 7, 10-nanometer chips. And so it's interesting to sort of see how that plays out, not just what we do, but then what the Chinese reaction is.
Yeah, and before you move on, let's talk about that a little bit. You know, SMIC is, I guess, the 3rd largest chip manufacturer in the world. It's a Chinese company. It's behind only Taiwan and Korea in its manufacturing capability. Could these export controls on semiconductor chip manufacturing equipment, chip fab equipment, have the unintended consequence of accelerating or catalyzing China's development of its domestic chip manufacturing ecosystem?
So I think we are clearly seeing China look at these export controls. They also think we're in an era of competition, and they are definitely doubling, tripling, quadrupling down on their own investments in indigenization. I think from at least the Biden administration's perspective, back when I served in the administration, they thought, well, actually, if we can stay 2 or 3 years ahead, if we can get an edge now of a couple of years, that's well worth it because of the importance of this competition. And that was sort of the judgment. It's not that the president didn't think, oh, this is going to prompt them to invest more. It's he thought, well, if this gets us a couple of years, that is time that is worth it for us to increase our edge in, for example, artificial intelligence. We can build an edge in certain other adjacent technologies and capitalize on that.
Yeah, I think the Chinese investment numbers just in the last year. I guess for 2023, we're something in the order of $150 billion in chip manufacturing capacity. And there's an expectation that, as investors, when we think about 2 years or 3 years, that goes very quickly. And it's been, I guess, 2 or 3 years since the Biden administration attempted to slow down China's ability to manufacture the very highest end semiconductors. I want to, in the interest of time, I want to move on to sort of tariffs and then even investment issues. And maybe we'll do it in reverse order. I think we all kind of understand the tariff picture and the tariff debate. But increasingly, I think we're not going to see new tariffs, despite all the rhetoric. The reality is the competition's going to be waged, I think, elsewhere, going to be waged, and you alluded to this in your first few comments, going to be waged on sort of Chinese manufactured goods and limitations on Chinese manufactured goods and investment, foreign investment in Chinese manufactured goods. Talk a little bit about that, and then this conversation, of course, cannot escape some discussion of TikTok. Where you think the TikTok conversation is going, and sort of what that means for Chinese companies going global and their ability to penetrate Western markets.
Well, I think if Trump comes back, we may see some increases in tariffs. I mean, whether he going to go to 60% or whatever his latest figure is, don't know. But I think you will want to raise them to some degree and get into some negotiation with the Chinese over that. I think if Harris wins, I agree with you. Tariff levels probably stay about where they are. Maybe a few national security type products, they go up. But I think you're right. What we're going to see is a focus on other aspects of the relationship. So, the President Biden has issued an executive order, has some bipartisan support, to in a very selective number of ways begin actually limiting U.S. investment in China. In private investment, not publicly traded investment, but certain private investments. And I think we could see some incremental expansion of that. And then I actually think, and David, you and I were talking about this a little bit before we came up here on the stage, I think the Trump administration was about tariffs. There was a lot of tariffs. Biden administration done a lot on export controls. I think over the next couple of years, actually, whether it is Trump or Harris, we are going to begin to see more action like what we're seeing on TikTok, where there is a Chinese technology that is being used here. Maybe it's a Chinese electric vehicle. Maybe it is a Chinese drone. There are proposals in Congress doing these DJI drones are flying overhead. I think we are going to see more and more restrictions that will be framed as national security restrictions. That thing, that TikTok spying on you, that drone might be spying on you, that are going to begin to put some pressure to limit the sales of those kind of things here in the U.S. Now, final point I want to make, because I know we're at time. For every geopolitical risk, there's an opportunity, right? If you had guessed the Trump tariffs correctly, you could have seen, well, Vietnam's going to be a huge beneficiary of this. And Vietnam's exports to the U.S. have more than tripled since Trump began putting tariffs on stuff. So you got to think about it not just from the risk perspective, but where are the investment opportunities from geopolitics?
And, we're believers that the Chinese economy is going to continue to grow. And so I think understanding the risk associated, whether it's tariffs, export controls, or other sanctions-related activities, there's still tremendous growth to be captured in the Chinese economy, because that manufacturing that's gone to Vietnam or has gone to Mexico, as the papers have described, those are Chinese firms that are the beneficiaries of shifting their supply chain. And that's why at CraneShares we spend a lot of time talking to smart people like you, Peter Harrell. And I want to thank you very much for your comments. I wish we had more time. I know that you're willing to stick around if there's some questions after, and we look forward to seeing you maybe next year here on the beach.
No, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.